Greetings. If this is your first visit to this podcast, I'm really glad you found it, and I think you'll enjoy this episode. If you're a returning listener, then I'm especially glad you're here, since it means you found something enjoyable here and motivates me to continue producing more and better stories. Before we get started, I want to thank my good friend Roy Camarillo for sending me this story. Several years ago, I was heading up the California and West Coast branch of Everyday Paranormal California. Some of you, I'm sure, remember that Everyday Paranormal was an organization started up by the Kling brothers in Texas, and they had a show called Ghost Lab on the Discovery Channel. Roy had been affiliated with his good friend and founder of Everyday Paranormal in Louisiana. He then moved to California's Bay Area. Through the miracles of social media, Roy and I got together and had done some paranormal investigations. When Roy found out I was collecting ghost stories, he shared this one with me, wrote it up, sent it to me in an email. Normally I prefer stories that were experienced firsthand by the person that was telling it to me. However, this story was so compelling and so creepy I had to include it in the collection. Not only that, but it does have some historical significance in that there is folklore that seems to back up the details of this story. Roy sent me a story, and in his words, it starts out like this. I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old when I heard this story. It was late 1950s summertime, and Pop took us all down to Santa Rosa, Texas, at the southern tip of the state, just a few miles north of the Mexican border. The population was maybe 200 or 300 at best. The town had 3 blinking yellow lights and a handful of buildings gathered around an old high school, a drugstore, a bank, and a county courthouse. I had a mess of family down there, including my grandmother Petrita, aunts and uncles, cousins in all directions. All of us, 1, 2, maybe 3 generations from ancestors who swam into Texas across the Rio Grande from Mexico. Down there and back then, we were dirt poor. I grew up with cousins and uncles who spent summer vacations chopping cotton in the fields and making money by the bushel or pound, depending on what they harvested. One summer night, we gathered on Tia Marina's porch. She had a small house across from the cotton gin on the main highway. We'd see a car maybe once every 20 minutes. It was hot and humid, even after the sun went down. The men drank beer, and us kids, we drank sweet lemonade, mostly hot. That night, there were maybe 10 of us gathered on the back porch, and somebody asked my great-uncle Meme to tell us this story. Meme wore these dark glasses, the kind that doctors prescribe when the light of day will damage the person's eyes. At first, he refused to tell the stories, but folks just kept on him until he finally gave in and told it. It was 1932 when Uncle Meme and his friend Roberto were driving to visit a friend. They were in a section of southern Texas known as the Devil's Woods. The name Devil's Woods was probably only known to locals, as you can't find it on the map. The people who called it that felt it was an appropriate name, and most people just stayed away from the area. Maybe it was because it was such a spooky-looking place, or maybe because of the stories that had developed over the years. You never know with old stories, and there's usually some truth involved in them. But when it's a place as dark and ominous looking as the Devil's Woods. It's just better to avoid going there if you can. On this particular day, Uncle Meme and his friend were forced to go through the Devil's Woods. The only way to get to the town they were going to was on the road that went right through the woods. So they said a little prayer and continued on their journey. Not long after entering the woods, they saw a hitchhiker standing on the side of the road. In the 1930s, picking up a hitchhiker was not considered as risky as it would be today. People generally helped each other when they could. The man looked like he might have been one of the indigent people living in the area. He was dressed in work pants and a long coat and wearing a thick headband. They pulled up just past him and stopped. He ran up, got in the back seat. There wasn't much cause to ask where he was going since the road only went one place. He smiled politely and waited as they started off again. It was just starting to get dark, and the long shadows of the trees were merging into an inky patchwork on the ground. Occasionally, Uncle Meme would look into the rear-view mirror and see the man sitting quietly, but looking straight ahead. They had gone a few miles when he looked in the mirror again. The man somehow looked slightly different, maybe even a little sinister looking. He had that look when somebody in the dark puts a flashlight under their chin and makes a mean face. Uncle Meme was starting to feel a little vulnerable and realized that it's a perfect stranger sitting behind him and could do all kinds of horrible things to him and his friend before they could even have a chance to fight back. He glanced up to the mirror again and almost screamed. The man was staring back at him. His eyes seemed to be glowing. He had an evil grin on his face. Uncle Meme's eyes were now darting back and forth from the road to the mirror, and what he saw next almost caused him to pass out from fear. The hitchhiker's face was changing and distorting, and he no longer looked human. The skin on his face was moving and hanging like the sheet off the edge of a bed. A gurgling, growling sound came from the man's gaping mouth, and Uncle Meme could wait no longer. He slammed on the brakes and at the same time let out an involuntary yell. Roberto had been dozing next to him, woke with a start, and thought something had run out in front of the car. Roberto felt pressure on the back of his seat as the hitchhiker pushed his way out of the car and ran off into the woods. Both men were stunned to see that the creature's whole body was changing, getting larger, and its clothes were ripping and falling off of him. Uncle Meme was now sick with fear, but also had a sense of relief that whatever had been in the back seat was running away and had not done any harm to either man. Not wanting to press his luck, he put the car back in gear. But the guard died. He looked up and could no longer see the creature, but heard snaps and rustling of something moving just out of sight in the trees. Both men began reciting any blessing or prayer that came to mind, as Uncle Meme tried several times to start the car. The car eventually did start and lurched into the night. Roberto just kept asking over and over again, "What was it? What the hell was that?" Uncle Meme couldn't answer and just shook his head back and forth saying, "I don't know. I don't know." When the men made their return trip a day later, they made sure to do it in broad daylight and at top speed. Needless to say, they didn't stop for anyone. Roy concluded the recounting of his Uncle Meme's tale with the following. My great Uncle Meme was a pretty stout guy, but that night he cried like a baby telling the story. As much as anything, it was seeing a grown man brought to tears by the telling of a tale that scared me. It chilled me to the bone. Whatever he saw out there, he sincerely believed it. As incredible as this tale may sound, it's not the first one of its type. There is a history of similar beings found in Native American stories. The Navajo have a belief in what's called a Skinwalker. The word for Skinwalker in the Navajo language is unpronounceable by me, but it means with it, he goes on all fours. The Skinwalker is someone who practices witchcraft and has the ability to change into anything they wish. In essence, they're not very nice beings and have the ability to cause great fear and can read thoughts. They often look like some kind of mutation between a human and the animal they are mimicking. Sometimes it appears they're wearing the ill-fitting skin of another creature. According to the tales, skinwalkers will run away when spotted or discovered. When I first heard this tale, I was reminded of my long-time favorite series of books by Carlos Castaneda. The Teachings of Don Juan was the first book in that series. The books recounted the adventures of Castaneda when he was a young anthropologist visiting Mexico. He met and eventually became a student of the powerful Yaqui shaman Don Juan. Castaneda told his first-person tales of encountering and interacting with all kinds of fantastic beings and even other students of Don Juan's, some of whom have even tried to kill him. Carlos Castaneda insisted that his books were factual accounts of the mystic world and only fictionalized many of the chronological details in order to keep the books interesting by leaving out the more mundane details. Critics are still divided on whether his accounts are true or not. But he lived a fascinating life, and even his death on April 27, 1998, was shrouded in mystery. Castaneda had dropped out of public view and was living a somewhat mystic life. He lived with 3 other women who also dropped out of public view and had cut off all ties with their families. When Castaneda died from complications from cancer, the women all disappeared. One of the woman's skeletal remains were eventually discovered months later in a car in the desert, but the other women were never seen again. I had read all of his books, so when I heard Roy's stories, I immediately saw a connection to the same kind of beings described by Castaneda. These kinds of beliefs have been handed down for centuries by the native peoples in Northern and South America. And things like skinwalkers are as real to them as trees and coyotes. I have a belief that humans may have a connection to the universe through their abilities to imagine and actually play a part in creating or molding reality. Maybe humans are the glue that holds the universe together, and that's our whole reason for being here. If that's true, it might explain much of what we call the paranormal. It could explain why different cultures have different beliefs in creatures and beings that are real for them but not to others, and why other cultures have varied descriptions of ghosts and spirits. Maybe paranormal events are not part of another world, but actually reside in this one, brought about by our own marvelous and powerful brains. If that's true, just imagine what could happen if we could all work together in millions and focus that power in one direction. Or maybe reality is just reality, and everything else is just a product of our fantasies. I want to share with you another similar story. This one also takes place south of the border in Argentina. A couple of years ago, my wife and I stayed a couple of nights on the Queen Mary, which has been turned into a floating hotel. As is usually the case, I was there to seek out ghost stories, and I wasn't disappointed. Almost every Queen Mary employee I talked to had a story or two to share. It was our waiter that served us several previous meals that had the most interesting story. And it was one that had nothing to do with the Queen Mary. He said he had never had a ghostly encounter on the ship, but several years before he had a terrifying one on the road in the middle of a dense forest in his home country of Argentina. Every year or so, Juan packs up his car and makes the long drive to his hometown in Argentina. This is a grueling 6,500-mile one-way trip. On one of these trips, his brother and mother were riding with him. The big milestone that marked the nearing of the end of their trip was a large extinct volcano that lay between them and their small hometown located on the other side. As he approached the summit, he noticed that everyone else in the car was asleep. The road meandered back and forth with occasional straight stretches, and Juan was glad for the challenge of the turns that kept his mind active on the last part of the long journey. About halfway down the mountain, he noticed something moving on the left side of the road near the ground. At first he thought maybe an animal had been struck by a car and was thrashing about in the grass. Then, unexpectedly, a human form appeared to rise from a prone position to standing as if it were hinged at its heels. It went from laying on its back to standing like some kind of vampire in a B movie. Adding to his immediate fear, the thing began to walk across the road directly in front of his car. As it stepped into his lane, it slowed, and it slowly turned its head, looking directly at him, making eye contact. Juan had no intention of stopping, and to make his point, he accelerated, bearing down on the humanoid figure. While the entity didn't seem to walk any faster, it did continue to walk, but it never broke its eye contact. It stepped off the road just as the car passed. Juan quickly looked in the rearview mirror but saw no one. It had vanished. The incident shook him up badly, but he didn't want to share it with his fellow travelers. Once they arrived in town, and he had relaxed a little, he told his brother and mother what had happened on the trip. He didn't know what he had seen, or even what to call it. Whatever it wasn't of this world. I did a considerable amount of research, hoping to find some reference to a South American road zombie or a spirit that hung around volcanoes and tormented drivers in Argentina. I was unable to find anything similar in this part of the world. It does seem that volcanoes have an international attraction for the supernatural. For example, Hawaii has the goddess Pele. A volcano in Iceland named Hekla was thought to be the door to the underworld and the home of the Prince of Darkness. In Japan, Mount Fuji is the home of multiple deities, including the goddess Senjin, also known as the goddess of Fuji. In this case, I wondered why a ghost, if that's what it was, would be in such a remote area. And then I stumbled upon an interesting article that led me to speculate a bit. Well, quite a bit. Several years ago, Several years ago, extremely well-preserved Incan mummies of young teens and children were discovered near the top of a volcano near the Argentinian and Chilean border. Perhaps the ghosts of ancient Incan sacrifices still roam these remote areas, or maybe the being was a spirit of nature like the goddess of Fuji. I suppose it's possible that people may be living in these remote areas, and who knows, maybe they like scaring the bejeebies out of motorists. Personally, I suspect this case is just a case of one being behind the wheel too long without enough sleep. I think it's more plausible that he was suffering from road fatigue. There are many documented cases of drivers experiencing hallucinations after being behind the wheel too long. But what about the first story? Did the men encounter a skinwalker in the South Texas forest? Maybe Great Uncle Omeme was just a great storyteller and was passing on a story that he had heard in his youth. Do you really believe it was made up? Really? Let me ask you a question. If you were driving down a remote southern Texas road in a place called the Devil's Woods, would you pick up a lone hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere as dusk approached? You don't believe in skinwalkers, do you? I had a great time with you and sharing these stories, and I hope you have too. I have a lot more true ghost stories to share with you and hope that you'll come back and listen. My goal here is to entertain and educate a little bit on the topic of the paranormal, but mostly just to have a little fun and maybe cause a chill to run down your spine. I invite you to go to my website, OutsideTheVeil.com, and click on the button marked Truth. There you'll find a page for each of these stories I've shared, along with relevant photos and documentation. Some pages have more than others. This is Dave Mace, and until next time, when we meet here, outside the veil.